Please do not adjust your set. Please do not adjust your set. This is Victor Pross speaking to you, anarchist artist. I prefer to be heard in this video podcast as opposed to be seen. So, it's more important what I have to say as opposed to watching me say it. So, now, there is a very common criticism that's tossed at the anarchist. Very common criticism. And to give you a little hint, it's in the title of this video. Is anarchism a pipe dream? Is anarchism a pipe dream? That is a very common criticism of the anarchist position. That basically that they are fuzzy thinking ideologues with either their head is up their ass or it's in the clouds. Maybe their head is in their ass while they're in the clouds, standing within, of course, an ivory tower. Excuse me. And this is a very common criticism. So one in which is, I think, worthy of dealing with, given the commonality of it. But more importantly, of what makes it a pressing matter for me is the falsehood of it. Now, that's one version of an anarchist society, and it's rather benign. It sounds like a kind of like a Garden of Eden. What it also has presupposes is also the idea that, let's say, that society is like Garden of Eden, where conflict and strife and a lust for power and the willingness to harm one's brother for one's own expense and greed and the like is removed from society. That human nature has become perfected, and therefore we don't need a government, you see, because we have human nature has been perfected, and we are now living in a Garden of Eden, and this is the ridiculous utopian fantasy of the pipe dreaming anarchists. So it's utopian is another version of saying of speaking of pipe dreams, of course, in this context. And that is one side that is presented. And then, with this whole idea of basically starting from the idea of a stateless society, then you have the flip side to this utopian Garden of Eden, and that is a rather nasty flip side. It's the complete antithesis of the first presentation. And in this case, life is far from beatific and benign. Now it's rather nasty. Thomas Hobbes comes to mind. Thomas Hobbes was an English 17th century philosopher, best known today, of course, for his political philosophy, and which he writes in his book The Leviathan, written in 1651, that life is in a state of nature pre-government. It's a state of nature where life is nasty, brutish, and short. Red tooth and claw is complete and utter nightmare of hell on earth, so to speak. So it's complete opposite of this utopian presentation. Now, obviously, these two clashing ideas cancel one of the each other out. I mean, it's one or the other. However, both of these charges or criticisms is constantly hurled at the anarchists, rather. So, no wonder that the whole idea of a stateless society strikes some people as, or a lot of people, many people, as utterly ridiculous. And given these two flavors, I would have to agree with that, of course. Of course, both of these versions is nonsense, but that's not where the anarchist is coming from. The anarchist is not coming from the premise that one day, inevitably, even in my lifetime, says the anarchist, well, we'll have this utopian stateless society, or that it's inevitable. You know, if not in my lifetime, at least it's inevitable. That, like, sort of like an historical determinism, it is meant to be. And this is another reason why the anarchist is seen as a ridiculous ideologue, if he thinks that a stateless society is inevitable. But that is not what the anarchist is saying, though. That is not what the anarchist is saying. Of course it's not inevitable. There's no such thing as historical determinism. Human beings have free will. So long as people have free will, that will determine the fate of history, and it's very complex. It's a sociological question, of course, but there's always been constant changes within society, and it's determined by the actors. There's no such thing, as I say, as some kind of historical determinism that prostrates free will, in which we are all caught up as driftwood into a sea of currents of God knows where we're going to be led to. So that that's the type of philosophies that is espoused by Rousseau with the general will, or even with Karl Marx's materialism, the historical or economic materialism, historical determinism. That's not where the anarchist is coming from. Okay, so it's not inevitable. It's all besides the point. Now, let's get to what the point is when it comes to where the anarchist is proceeding from, and that is not some kind of vision of how society will be, or and that vision being flawless. Of course not. Or alternatively, on the more negative side, where it would just be necessarily brutal, and where society would completely collapse, that even the most despotic and wretched and evil of dictatorships is preferable to this Hobbesian state of nature. Forget about both of those ridiculous ideas. Just remove them from your mind, and let's get back to the basic principle of the matter. And the principle of the matter is to understand that it is a principle where the anarchist is coming from. Now, just looking at the word anarchy, it simply means without rulers, not without rules. And that is the basic definition. It simply means without rulers, not without rules. That is what is being presented. It's not saying that it's inevitable, that it has to come about. It's just that's the definition. So the word anarchy is from the Greek the prefix a, or an, meaning not, the absence of or the lack of, anarchy, and you have archy, meaning a ruler or a leader or a form of government such as monarchy, oligarchy. You get the idea. So what is the moral guts of anarchy? Moral opposition. Moral opposition, that's all it means. It doesn't espouse and fabricate and build up all these societies of what's inevitable, and it's going to be beatific, and angels are going to dance all on the streets. That's not where the anarchist is coming from. It's standing for a moral principle that violence is wrong. Violence is wrong. It doesn't get any more simpler than that. Initiating violence is wrong against to initiate force against innocent people, to violently attack their individual rights, their sovereign being, is wrong. So, if we understand anarchy from that standpoint, that it's based on the non-aggression principle, it is a general principle that if you advocate that violence is wrong, it's not a sometime principle. There's no such thing as a sometime principle. It has to be applied consistently. You cannot say that, yes, I'm a decent human being, I'm against violence, I'm against murder. Of course I am. Were you kidding me? I'm a decent human being. You can't come from that premise and then just say, yeah, but except sometimes. So because you just violated the principle. You completely snuffed the life out of a principle. It's no longer a principle if you say that, yeah, I'm against murder and theft, except when the government does it. Okay. Now you have to understand that the government, of course, is the initiation of institutionalized force. It has to initiate force in order to establish its rule and to maintain its rule. It in perpetuity and perpetually has to initiate violence through taxation. To maintain itself and to first establish itself, it has to initiate violence. That is the common thread that ties all governments together throughout the world, throughout all the ages. That is a fundamental characteristic of government. Of course, it flies in the face and of the non-aggression principle. Of course, it flies in the face of individual rights, and of course, therefore, it cancels the principle out. Now, in advocating the non-aggression principle, the non-aggression principle is not some kind of fucking anarchist doctrine. Okay, it's not a religious dictum. It's a general principle that is secular in nature, that is rational in nature, that is the bedrock and the backbone and the spinal fluid of any civilized society. And it also applies to the life of an individual, that the individual himself in a given society, if he is to be a decent human being, of course that to be a decent human being, he has to be against violence. And if he is to be consistent with the principle, he cannot say, yes, I'm against murder, except when it comes to the government, because you just canceled the principle out. The government is just made up of people. It's a general principle that has to apply consistently. And you do it because it is the right thing to do. It's not for the inevitability of some stateless society. You just apply the principle consistently. And naturally, the government rubs up against this. So, of course, if the anarchist is proceeding from being a decent human being who embraces the non-aggression principle, like most people do in the conduct of their life, the anarchist is just simply taking it an extra step further to saying that all of society's institutions have to be voluntary, and this institution known as government is not. So, therefore, by implication, it's out of the picture. It's off the table. That is all where the anarchist is coming from. Now, in the whole idea of going back to this challenge or charge of utopianism, well, just let's go back to the issue of murder. Now, if you say that, yes, I'm against murder, I'm against theft, that does not mean, therefore, that you're advocating or espousing some kind of idea that murder, therefore, will be at some point in history ruled out throughout society, and it will no longer, and we will return to a state of perfect bliss in the Garden of Eden. No, you're just doing it because you're a decent human being. You're against murder. It doesn't mean that murder won't be a part of society. It doesn't mean that you won't have nasty people where killing is a reality, and that's what happens in certain societies or in most societies. Of course, you know, it's an unfortunate thing, but it's a part of reality, and you have to contend with it. But it doesn't mean, therefore, we should not have a principle against murder. Of course not. So that's where the anarchist is coming from. It's coming from a principle. It's not the proselytizing about some golden society or that some inevitable golden society or whatever. But insofar as that it is concerned, let's do keep one thing in mind. I'm not saying that no, that anarchism and a stateless society is impossible. It's not impossible. It's not inevitable, but it's not impossible. There's been social changes throughout the ages. Somebody during the plantation slavery days, if somebody was an abolitionist, somebody would have said, "Well, you're a utopian. You think that slavery is going to end one day? Like you're up there in the dream clouds, there, buddy." I mean, but it became a reality. So, of course, a stateless society is not something that's ruled off as being a social reality. It's just not inevitable. And it's not, the anarchist not saying that, yeah, in my lifetime sometimes it'll come about. It's all a matter of standing for principle. It doesn't get any more complicated than that. Okay, I think hopefully I dealt with the question. If not, hurl any questions. Thank you for listening. Victor Pross signing out. Anarchist artist. Pop goes to culture.